So hello and welcome to today's webinar, Medium and Heavy Duty Electric Vehicle Charging Roadmap, which is co-hosted by Advanced Clean Tech News and the North American Council for Freight Efficiency. Thank you to our webinar sponsor, Black & Veatch. Our panelists provide a diverse set of perspectives on what it takes to establish a successful EV charging strategy. First up, we have Mike Roeth, the Executive Director at NACFE. Mike's organization works to drive the development and adoption of efficiency-enhancing, environmentally beneficial, and cost-effective technologies, services, and methodologies in the North American freight industry. Today, Mike will discuss findings from NACFE's recent report, Amping Up, Charging Infrastructure for Electric Trucks. David Peterson, the Director of Fleet Solutions at ChargePoint, which hosts the nation's largest network of EV charging stations, will discuss appropriate charging station hardware options to support your fleet vehicles and how smart load management can make or break the economics of electrification. Next, Kim Voellmann, a business analyst for the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, California's largest utility, will share a utility's perspective on the process and timeline for establishing on-site charging infrastructure for commercial EVs, as well as an overview of her organization's EV fleet program. Our last speaker, Paul Stith, the Director of Strategy and Innovation for Black & Veatch, which is a global leader in engineering, procurement, and construction services for energy, water, and telecommunications, will provide an engineering perspective on EV charging infrastructure development, including realistic timelines for site planning, permitting, and charger installation. Finally, I'd like to introduce Jessie Lund, an associate with Rocky Mountain Institute, who is a lead author on NACFE's charging report and who will be moderating the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Before we get rolling, here are a few things to keep in mind. You can submit questions using the Q&A box located on your webinar control panel. Please direct your questions to the organizer and we'll save these for the end. If you'd like to watch the webinar again, a recording will be sent out by the end of the week. At the end of the webinar, we'll have a 30-second survey and we'd love to receive your feedback. And finally, for any technical issues, please contact Nikki at GNA using the email address you see on screen. Okay, last intro item. For anyone who is interested in learning more about the exciting market advancements taking place across the commercial transportation sector, I'd like to invite you to join our team at the Advanced Clean Transportation Expo, taking place April 23rd to the 26th at the Long Beach Convention Center in Southern California. We have a number of workshops and panels planned that will expand upon the topics discussed today, including a NACFE-hosted workshop on the future of regional freight movement, a full-day EV charging infrastructure workshop, a battery technology workshop, and a medium and heavy-duty electric truck technology showcase. As a thank you for participating today, you can save $50 off your ACT Expo registration using the code webinar503. So make sure to jot that code down. All right, with that said, I'm excited to turn the controls over to Mike Roeth with NACFE.
Hello, thank you, Sarah. And this is going to be a fun webinar. We're looking forward to talking about charging systems and explaining a little bit about what NACFE found in our work, and then, hearing from, some of the real players that are out there with the deployments and working on the challenges, whether it's utility, the infrastructure itself, the hardware and software, and really how you manage these projects. So very excited about this particular webinar. NACFE's 10 years old this year, so we are a nonprofit that works in this space, trying to help manufacturers and manufacturers and fleets and others understand the technologies that are emerging, and some of which who are already available, to get better freight efficiency. So that's fuel economy, it's operations, it's total cost of ownership to spend less money, earn less fuel, in moving the goods around North America. So have a look at our site, NACFE.org. One of the things about that workshop at ACT Expo that we're excited about is we're going to, throughout the year, explore regional freight. And so, that's typically Class 8 tractors, some day cabs, some sleepers, but those that have more predictable routes. And we see that particular part of the market growing. And with its growth, it'll have a lot of benefits, or could have a lot of benefits for trucking. One, it gets the drivers home more frequently. And two, it would really help with the infrastructure deployment for some of these alternative fuels. If we know more about where the trucks are going on a regular basis, it'll be easier to deploy that infrastructure. And NACFE, we work across a lot of different areas. The left side of this is what we call scaling available technologies. And these are technologies that are available today, but maybe not at full scaling or penetration. So if you think about classic adoption curves, they're early in the life. And so we call that our current technology work. And then as you look sort of into the future, the things that are coming and evolving, whether it's electric trucks, self-driving trucks, platooning, on and on, we are beginning to work in that area. So our first efforts in helping to guide the trucking industry with new technologies has been on electric trucks. And we're in the middle of a series of reports. We call them guidance reports. The one we just recently published that's mainly the topic of the day is on how we charge those electric trucks. But we have published two prior to that. One is where electric trucks make sense across class 3 to 8, across all of the different truck classes and sort of applications. And then in the fall of 2018, we published one on very specific to the total cost of ownership of medium duty electric trucks. And then later this year, and we've begun this work, we are tackling regional haul and long haul tractors. And that's whether it will be battery electric only or some sort of range extended electric based product. And so by the end of this year, we'll have this series done. And of course, we will then start it over again and update the various documents or whatever. But it's an exciting time for the potential of electric trucks throughout the medium and heavy duty marketplace. And so a kind of a quick overview of the work we've done to date. That first guidance report published a year ago. We actually published it at ACT Expo. And, it's a deep dive into, electric trucks. And, we found these 10 arguments for an electric trucks. It's kind of interesting. But what you'll find from us as you go into the future technologies of the website is a good deal of, free information that, executive summaries, a video, some tools around looking at electric versus diesel or gasoline. We do charge a bit for the full report, but those reports are pretty substantial with, somewhere around 100, 150 pages and, a good solid bibliography and graphics that can really help whether you're a manufacturer, a fleet, a utility, or whoever think about this. And, this is an example of one where, we looked at why and found that, there's a lot of, people propagating, electric trucks are the way of the future. You'd be a fool to buy diesel, all the way to really a battery is going to haul freight. I mean, that's silly. And there's too many challenges. So somewhere in the middle is the reality. And we found 10 of those sort of items. As we moved into the medium duty cost of ownership with, smaller trucks, we found this is probably the place where we will see early adoption. Those trucks stay home. They have limited range. You can charge them at the site, the fleet sites, et cetera. And, we put together a good bit of information here. Keys for this was a total cost of ownership, pretty transparent calculator, which is free to download. We'd be interested in many of you giving us feedback on that. And then we found a lot of at this point, a lot of unknown factors, but many of those factors are actually benefits of electric trucks. And so that's a particularly interesting one. But the topic for today is charging infrastructure. And with this, what we found is available. We published this about a month ago. And what we found, the following speakers will get into some more details on it. But really, the infrastructure is has three components to it. One is the hardware itself. So, you need a charging station, you need power to that charging station. So there's some hardware elements to the infrastructure. There is maintenance. Anytime you have hardware, or software, you need to maintain it. So it's important to include that in the plans, whether that's contracted maintenance or on-site maintenance. But obviously there's preventative maintenance and things that can go wrong with anything. And then finally, the software and the networking that makes it happen. So this is a number of things, including how what is the logic behind charging different trucks on the same charger, or the same system, or multiple chargers, or little trucks versus big trucks, and how that electricity gets managed over time, as well as other elements to it. And this is my last slide, in the introduction of this webinar, and that is that we created a roadmap, and these are 8 steps in the deployment of infrastructure once you chose to, purchase electric trucks, or we call them commercial battery electric vehicles. And some of these would seem very obvious, but what we wanted to do in the research that we did, the interviews we did with utilities and manufacturers of trucks and the infrastructure, et cetera, is put a roadmap together. We're seeing that fleets across the 3 to 8 now have confidence in the batteries. They have confidence that the vehicles are coming. And clearly the next big barrier is the charging infrastructure. So, we want the trucks to show up when the chargers are ready, and vice versa. It's really, we need both of these to be successful. It's sort of like washing your clothes. You need a washer and a dryer. So we need the trucks and we need the charging infrastructure, and making that come together at the exact same time. You wouldn't buy a washer and then buy a dryer for your clothes, a year down the road, you need them both at the same time. This is our collection of findings. And, I'm not going to go through each one of them, but sort of the big findings for us was, of course, collaboration is important. There's a lot to do at these sites. You got real estate, you got utility, you got the infrastructure, you got, brick and mortar. There's a lot to do here. So include all of those stakeholders early as possible. It's going to take some time, and then, we really want to learn from each of these deployments separately, and make it so the second one, the third one, the 10th one, the 50th one, they all learn from each other. So part of that will be transparency and openness by the early deployment projects and the people involved. And we think that'll be really critical to the next years of deployment of electric trucks along with charging. So I'm going to stop there and thank you, and we'll be answering some questions in a little bit, but now I'll turn it over to David Peterson of ChargePoint. David?
Great, thanks, Mike. I like that point that you made about collaboration. I think that's super critical to engaging all stakeholders, and we'll be talking about that. So again, I'm David Peterson, Director of Fleet Solutions at ChargePoint. ChargePoint celebrated its 11-year birthday. So NACFE did 10, we did 11. Must have been a good time for companies entering, I guess, efficiency and alt fuel. But we've been around for 11 years, mostly focused in our history on the consumer market. That's where the vehicles have been for the majority of the past decade. But now we're seeing a lot more medium and heavy duty vehicles. In particular, the transit market today is quite robust in terms of most OEMs having an offering that they're going to be delivering this year and in the coming years. We're looking at about roughly 500 to 600 units this year in the transit market. But that's going to be growing considerably out into the future. And then in the goods delivery space, as we call it, medium and heavy duty trucks and vans. This year, the market's probably looking about 3,500, maybe a little bit more than that, 5,000. There's quite a large variance around these numbers, depending on some big movers and shakers placing some large orders. But this market is definitely going to be picking up. So we already see some solid offerings in the medium duty space. and all the major manufacturers have announced product in the coming years. So we're quite excited about that. So I won't dwell on this too much because I think Mike covered a lot of it in his presentation. We're all aware of the lower emissions, at least the local emissions from these vehicles, the lower maintenance costs of these vehicles, as well as the lower operating costs in terms of electric fuel, but we'll get to that in a moment. But the other really cool thing that electrification offers is a different kind of visibility and control over fuel that you never had before with petroleum fuels. And that there's a sort of ubiquity with electricity in terms of its availability and how you can generate it. And there's a lot of flexibility in that gives fuel providers or fleet owners a new opportunity to take control over how they fuel their vehicles. Everything from the types of feedstocks, for example, into electricity. You can start thinking about how you get your electricity off the grid. We'll hear more from PG&E in the following presentation, but just suffice to say that there's a lot of new possibilities that get introduced into fueling when it comes to electricity, and I'll touch on a few other things related to that in this presentation. So when you're approaching a project, it's important to think about what vehicles you're considering. This is focused on medium and heavy, but we all know that a lot of environments have even off-road vehicles that could be coming into the fray, and I include those when I think about medium and heavy. So if you think about a facility that could have yard tractors, medium-duty trucks, heavy-duty tractors, we need to be thinking about how to charge all of those vehicles at a facility in the most efficient way, and what the energy requirements are for those vehicles. And so to do that, you have to take a deep dive into the operations. You need to really understand the workflow, when the vehicles arrive, when do they depart, what are their duty cycles, and then even broaden the scope to understand other sorts of energy loads that could be happening on site. And so as a starting point, you need to start thinking comprehensively instead of thinking about it on a vehicle by vehicle basis, because that sort of short-term thinking won't necessarily lead to the most optimal outcomes for your fueling. And so as Mike mentioned, I really like this, get everyone involved, take a multi-stakeholder approach. And the reason for that is this is a fueling project now that in many cases will be a depot fueling model, at least for the initial rollout to these vehicles. Long haul transportation, that tends to be look a bit more like throughput fueling, and that'll become clearer as the operating models are studied down the road. But in terms of the near term obvious use cases for electrification, we're looking at urban and regional goods movement. And that will absolutely lead to a dominant depot fueling model. And that means you're no longer doing throughput fueling, you're really fueling when you're parked for the most part. And that means you're involving a different set of stakeholders in terms of facilities management, who owns the building, who owns the parking lot, who manages that, who manages the electricity at the site, who pays the utility bill, for example. So this is a whole other set of stakeholders that need to be brought in to really start thinking in the right way about bringing fuel to your site, electric fuel to your site. So this brings me to the infrastructure question. And so initially, the way we recommend taking an approach is to assess, what you have available today. What's your electrical capacity today? How much spare capacity do you have available? What opportunities are there to make your existing loads more efficient, to basically minimize the cost of having to do any upgrades? Now, as you electrify in the long run, that will also help you plan future capital investments. And also, this will definitely help your utility plan along with you in terms of any new service upgrades that you will need to support your site. And going back to the matching the vehicles and the infrastructure. So it's important to understand what vehicles you're looking at. And I'll touch on this right now. I don't go in depth in it in this presentation. But that one really important thing when you're considering your vehicles and your infrastructure is how they all connect. What are the connector standards on the inlet, on the vehicle, on the charging station itself? For the most part, there seems to be a convergence on CCS1. This is the combo standard for DC fueling. There's convergence on SAE J1772 for AC fueling. But there are now new standards such as SAE J3068, which is three-phase AC fueling. And there is not a standard yet for really high power charging, like to deliver a megawatt of power. And then there are some other standards out there, such as CHAdeMO, which is prevalent on some medium duty Japanese manufactured vehicles as well. So there's a plethora of standards, but there is some convergence around some key standards. So it's important to understand what vehicles you have and what are the connector types that they would accept. Sometimes they can accept multiple types. And then start thinking about what type of infrastructure is going to be necessary to charge those vehicles. And you may even make some decisions about infrastructure based on, or rather you may even make some decisions around vehicles based on the type of infrastructure you want to have. Because you start thinking about uniformity and simplicity on the workflow. So do you want to have an operator determine if that vehicle is going to take AC charging or DC charging? Is that a decision you really want an operator to make? Or is that something you want to take out of their hands and simply have them plug in the vehicle, and then on the back end, the fuel system manages that for them? So there are a whole bunch of considerations, and I don't need to go into too much detail there, but I did leave a specific discussion on standards out of this presentation. But happy to address anything about those in the questions. So some key differences between light duty and vehicles, medium duty, and heavy duty vehicles. Well, light duty vehicles tend to have lower voltage batteries. And this is pretty critical. And this, if there's one takeaway you get out of this presentation, it's that there are significant differences in the voltages of the batteries in these vehicles. So light duty vehicles tend to have lower voltage batteries. Heavier vehicles tend to have higher voltage. Now this is critical, but it's not always the rule. So we know that a lot of the heavy duty vehicle prototypes actually are low voltage batteries because they're leveraging off the shelf technology from light duty suppliers. But really that's not a sustainable long run solution. It's a good way to get started, but ultimately it's going to break out, as you see here on the screen. And the benefits of that are, as you move to higher voltages, you don't need as much amperage to deliver the same amount of power. And that's really important. Because to deliver 500 kilowatts of power on a low voltage battery would require a lot of amperage, which means larger electrical capacity at a given site. Now, the medium duty space right now seems to be leaning more to the lower voltage batteries, but there are some class 4, class 5 vehicles that are putting higher voltage packs on their vehicles. And so this is something to be aware of, because when you talk about power to a vehicle, you really need to understand the voltage of the battery in order to really determine whether or not those power levels are attainable. And so I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but this chart is meant to just illustrate this in a slightly different way. So if you see here your class 1 vehicles, class 1, class 2 light duty cars and trucks, they tend to charge at really low powers, and they tend to charge typically on AC. So you're seeing here about 3.3 to 7.7 kilowatts. And then as you move across from class 1 and 2 to 3 and 6, you start moving to higher power AC. And then once you get into the heavy vehicles, class 7, 8 vehicles, it just doesn't make any more sense to charge on AC because those are really big batteries. And now, I suppose that's a little bit of my own opinion that it doesn't make sense, as there is a J3068 standard, which is now a 3-phase AC standard that would allow some of these larger vehicles to charge on AC power. But there are significant benefits to charging with DC, and I'm happy to address those in the Q&A because I don't want to spend too much time on that. And then as you move up to more and more power, you start to see how higher power starts to make sense in different ways. So higher power for light duty, class 1 and 2 means fast charging. Higher power for class 7, 8 can be just long dwell time charging, or it can be fast charging. And I should point out that the 2 megawatt charging today, there's no standard. ChargePoint's introduced a prototype that's got a connector that has 4 pins at 500 amps per pin, which would enable a vehicle to charge at 2 megawatts on a 1,000 volt battery. So that's typically less if the battery were at 700, 750 volts. But the point here, the takeaway is that there's a variety of power levels that correspond to a range of battery voltages. And that should be considered when thinking about the type of infrastructure you may need. Obviously, you want to think about the long term. When you're investing this much power, potentially megawatts of power at a single site, that's not a consideration that's made overnight. You really want to think about what you're going to be deploying over the next 1 to 5 years in order to really get the most out of your investment. And it's not simply about the hardware. A lot of it is going to be about the software and how that software helps you manage your power. And it's not also isolated to just the charging station itself or how the charging station pulls electricity from the grid or from other generation sources. It's also about integrating with the existing fleet management systems. So departure times, arrival times, understanding what is happening with the fleet so everything is happening in sync can really help optimize your fueling operations. So are we fueling first the vehicle that leaves in 24 hours or the vehicle that leaves in 6 hours? Right? We would rather not fuel those vehicles at the same time, for example, if there were cost savings to doing that. So it's a real paradigm shift in terms of how you think about fueling, that not all vehicles necessarily need to be fueled at the same time or even necessarily to 100%. So this is why it's really important to take advantage of the new opportunities that electric fuel brings to really start to drive more efficiency into how you can get more savings out of your electric fueling system. So just to wrap up, obviously infrastructure is key. The charging stations, the on-site infrastructure, and obviously the distribution infrastructure on the utility side. Take a multi-stakeholder approach. Don't isolate your decision-making to just one team. Let's say just vehicle procurement. Really broaden the number of people that you engage. Think about how vehicles can match the infrastructure. So think about those different battery voltages, different connector types, and definitely plan for the long term. And think also more broadly about your operations and how to integrate EVs in the right way in your operations to really take advantage of the new opportunities that electric fueling brings. You can find out more about us on our website, chargepoint.com, and we'll also be at the ACT Expo, so definitely come by our booth or contact us separately to set up a meeting. So now I'd like to pass it off to Kim Voellmann of PG&E.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Hi, I'm Kim Voellmann. I'm going to be talking about PG&E's EV Fleet Program. So we were approved for the EV Fleet Program just about a year ago, last June. And this is a medium and heavy duty infrastructure program. We were awarded $236 million to spend over 5 years, starting this year and through 2023. Our goal is to install charging infrastructure at over 700 sites and to support the adoption of about 6,500 new electric vehicles. So as we're covering medium and heavy duty vehicles, this is anything from delivery trucks, school buses, transit buses, and including off-road as well. So this is a little mix of what we're kind of targeting for our portfolio under the program. Like I said, medium duty, heavy duty, and off-road, just a couple of targets here to highlight. For transit, a minimum of 15% of our budget will be dedicated to transit bus projects, and then a maximum of 10% of our budget will be dedicated to forklift infrastructure projects. But just broadly looking for a diverse portfolio based on kind of the customers that we see coming in and how we can assist their projects. All right, so a lot to digest here. I'll try to walk you all through it as best I can. So the EV Fleet Program, 2 ownership options of the infrastructure here. I'll start with the PG&E owned option, which you can see under the graphic. So for the PG&E owned option, PG&E will pay for, construct, own, and maintain all of the electrical infrastructure from the power pole to the charger. And just a caveat here is that the eligibility and availability of this option is kind of based on project scope and project cost. So that will be determined once we start evaluating the site. The other option is the customer-owned option, in which PG&E would pay for, construct, own, and maintain everything from the power pole to the PG&E meter. And then everything beyond the meter would be covered by the customer up until the charger. For this option, we are offering an infrastructure incentive available to participants, and that you can see detailed in the blue box on the right. So that is a per vehicle incentive based on the vehicle type. So for transit buses and Class 8 trucks, you would receive a $9,000 incentive per vehicle. Transportation refrigeration units, truck stop electrification, ground support equipment, and forklifts receive $3,000 per vehicle, and then everything else, which includes school buses, local delivery trucks, etc., would be $4,000 per vehicle. And then in addition, for no matter which ownership option a site selects, the program participant would procure and pay for the charging station. And then we have additional rebates available for the charger, which is available to schools, transit agencies, and disadvantaged communities. And that charger rebate amount is based on the power level of the charger, as you can see highlighted in the orange box up top. And we are in the process of qualifying approved charging station vendors, which a program participant would have to select from that list of approved vendors for their charger to be eligible for the rebate as well. Okay, so how to prepare, what we need from you, our customers, and interested participants. First of all, this is available, of course, to PG&E customers in our service territory. And we encourage interested customers to first visit our website, the program website, pge.com/evfleet, where we have a lot of program materials, resources, tools. We have some cost calculators, rebate calculators, all of that, which is very helpful in informing a decision. But in terms of eligibility, we want to see a demonstrated commitment to procure at least 2 electric, medium, or heavy-duty fleet vehicles. So we do ask for a purchase order as part of our contracting phase for at least 2 vehicles. We also want to see a long-term electrification growth plan and schedule of load increase. So along with the procurement plan, we'll ask for in the contracting stage sort of a plan for load growth over the next 5 years to help inform our project planning process. And then we also request that participants provide us charger utilization data for at least 5 years. And then lastly, the participant will need to own or lease the property where chargers will be installed and operate and maintain the vehicles and chargers for at least 10 years. All right, so here's a roadmap to electrification, which actually looks very similar to Mike's roadmap, which is a positive thing. So I'll just kind of walk through the steps. This is how we're approaching our EV fleet program, but I think can also be applied more broadly to electrification planning and thinking through that process. So first, of course, is to establish electrification goals. And a key theme here is to engage stakeholders early. It's going to include many diverse stakeholders, so it's good to get everyone on board early on. Conducting a rate analysis to identify impacts to your electric bill and kind of how energy usage is going to be impacted. Identify a timeline for electrification, and also explore additional funding opportunities. So that could be for vehicles, additional support for infrastructure build out, or charging stations. I know PG&E, we are working with other state agencies and organizations who are offering funding programs to support these sectors, and we're trying to coordinate with them as best we can to support our customers and help make electrification more affordable for them. Second is to engage your utility for the EV fleet program. That involves starting with filling out our interest form, which is available on our website. At that point, we would reach out to you and start learning more about your project. So we would get on site, do a site walk, and start a capacity assessment. Next, you'll want to start vehicle OEM outreach if that hasn't been started yet in this process. So PG&E is partnering with a number of OEMs that we can refer customers to help them start that process. There's lots of technologies out there, so it may take some time to find the best option for your fleet. And then next would be kind of refining the project scope, confirming your electrification plan, charging station location, taking into consideration any operational changes that that implies for your fleet, and then selecting your chargers based on how you want to charge your vehicles. Then we would move to preliminary design. PG&E would create that prelim design for participants, and at that point is where we would be able to tell which of the two ownership options your site would be eligible for. Once prelim design is complete, we would then move to final design and construction, begin infrastructure build out, and then the customer or program participant would coordinate the procurement and installation of the chargers, after which chargers would be activated and ready for use. And then finally, ongoing operations and maintenance of the chargers for 10 years. So I also wanted to highlight our proposed commercial EV rate, which kind of goes hand in hand with our EV fleet program. So PG&E has proposed a new commercial EV rate plan, which we are hoping will be available to our customers in 2020, but is still under review with the California Public Utilities Commission. So the gist of the new rate is that it eliminates demand charges and instead implements a monthly subscription charge based on demand of the site, so kind of the charging behavior of the site. And then there are overage charges if the monthly demand goes over the subscription level. And in order to enroll in this plan, you will need to have a new dedicated meter in service dedicated to those electric vehicle charging stations. So just to look at an example of the fuel cost savings that the commercial EV rate offers, just this example looks at a fleet of delivery trucks. We're assuming 50 vehicles. They have 50 chargers at 19 kW each, so level 2 charging. In terms of operations, we're assuming an average of 150 miles per day, vehicle with 1.6 kWh per mile efficiency, and then we're also assuming that it operates only during the week, so about 20 days per month. And in terms of charging behavior, we're looking at overnight depot charging. So just taking a look at the estimated results table, you can see that in each category, as compared to the current rates, the commercial EV rate is cheaper in all categories, with some key takeaways of the average fuel cost per mile on the CEV rate drops more than 30% below that of gas or diesel. In addition, the commercial EV rate achieves a monthly bill savings of about 25%. So really looking to make electric vehicle charging more affordable for our commercial customers here. So if you or a customer of yours are ready to electrify, please connect with us. Again, I highly recommend that you start with our website, pge.com/evfleet, where you can learn more about the program and submit an interest form. And then if you're an interested OEM, please contact our OEM partner lead, Ann Camperson. Her email is on the slide here, or you can go to pge.com/evfleetomem to learn more. So that's all I had, and thanks so much. I'll kick it over to Paul Stith with Black & Veatch now.
Perfect, and thanks everybody, by the way, for before me. So I'm Paul Stith with Black & Veatch, Director of Strategy and Innovation, and I kind of focus on what we're doing, where we're headed next, where do we take our tool set from 104 years, by the way, of experience in building infrastructure. How do we move it into these next markets? And so pretty excited to be attending also ACT Expo and be very active in this space, whether you know it or not. So I'll go ahead and jump right in. And some of my slides are a little bit duplicate, which again, that's a great sign. I like the roadmaps looking a lot alike. Also about stakeholders. So I'm going to have a few of those kinds of slides that I can breeze through, and then I can kind of talk from our point of view. And at the end, when you get our slides, I've got some great reference documents that you can download when we talk about timelines for different types of power access for fleets and things like that. So very happy to be here, and let's roll. So we are employee owned, by the way, since 104 odd years. And we're working around the world. We do work in power, water, and telecom. And since we're employee owned, we tend to kind of follow, where our employees' hearts and minds are going and where the market is going, and we're not where the stock market is trailing. So some pretty interesting things that we can do in that, and definitely invest in space that are important in changing the future, of course, across all the energy. What folks who may know Black & Veatch, they might not have discovered this, that since 2012-13, we've been pretty active building high-power charging infrastructure, working for clients such as Tesla. We're right in the middle of doing a tremendous amount of work for Electrify America. We've been working in transit now for over 3 years, and we've got active projects in the medium duty and in the semi-truck space. So it's pretty exciting. And it's not just the plug-in. We do work in hydrogen. We do work in all of these kind of emerging spaces around distributed energy. So partly what everybody else has talked about battery voltages and so forth, and packs and so forth, but the real trend line here is really just about bigger batteries that are being unlocked for economics. You can see what's happening in the fleet space, what it is that actually drives these things, as well as, a consumer. When a consumer wants something, consumers go for it, and that's pretty well demonstrated by the Model 3 and what's happening. The fleets are looking at total cost of ownership, duty cycles, and maintenance and so forth. So it doesn't at all translates into that the needs are going to be much larger for the charging infrastructure, larger batteries, more vehicles. So even at lower power, if you have a facility of 100 vehicles, you're certainly going to have a cumulative amount of power that's going to add up quite a bit. So in the earlier days, you're barely trying to find place to fit in on an existing panel, and David mentioned some things about that, of a survey of an existing location, but really we're finding that these facilities are going to need new power. So you kind of have to understand and learn a little bit more about switch gear, and do you reintegrate? Do you add a new meter, and what new chartered areas for warehouses that wouldn't have had to do this in the past, for example. Some of the quotes are that you have a facility, it's going to need 5 to 10 times the amount of energy. UPS said something like that out there about their facilities. We're seeing heavy duty trucking that are going to need 100 times the amount of energy that they have if it's just a warehouse without air conditioning, for example, but it serves 100 or more trucks. It's a pretty dramatic change. So you need to learn a little bit more about power delivery, cost of energy, and then of course if you have sustainable, and of course many of the states do, renewable content, what is the strategy overall for how you're going to fill that into, of course, the infrastructure. And we see it happening in corridors, what's happening with freight, and I kind of mentioned autonomous already. Aviation is a pretty exciting space where many of the same things are going to repeat out in that space as it electrifies. This is just a nice map, reference, to learn a little bit more about how power is distributed, because all of that infrastructure has a asset life, and of course the utilities need to look at their investment plans and find ways, of course, to predict and understand where you need to bring the load and how do you make smarter loads in some cases, of course, so you don't have to build as much distribution. So it's new vocabulary. I won't highlight it that long. What we do see is a lot of pilots going on. And what we know about the timelines for pilots are a lot of work that happens just to get over the pilot itself. So, but what we know is the timelines needed for planning for power and the capital planning that's kind of been mentioned earlier is you need to start those things sooner than you'd expect. And you need to be watching and figuring out not just one facility, but if you have many facilities in your fleet, how does that going to look? And do you have distributed energy opportunities in your distribution network, or is it going to be only at your hubs? How are you going to build what will become an energy network in your fuel supply chain? And in the end is that you really need to be ready for the tipping point. And if you're not already working towards these strategies, you're going to find yourself at the tipping point. And if electrification is actually more cost effective, which I think we all believe it will be, you're going to be behind. And so we want to make sure that you start to look at that across facilities and then think of it as a program. And within a particular facility, this is just something that I wanted to throw out there, is just that, and David mentioned as well, you'll look at opportunities to be modular about it. What is the size of switchgear? How is the voltage going to come on property? If it's going to be anywhere above 2 megawatts, for example, 2 to 2.5, depending on the utility, you may also be looking at a medium voltage service and how you can position smart charging and storage, other things on the site. But one way or another, you have to have a plan for how you're going to electrify that entire fleet at its end state. This is some things that we did some work about electric VTOL, that vehicles that are going to fly in the sky that are going to charge at 600 kilowatts each. So some pretty exciting things, but the concepts apply regardless of the type of vehicle, whether it's on the ground, actually whether it's in the water, or it happens to fly. Stakeholder slide, everybody has one. This is kind of mine. And I think that you're needing to look at everything holistically, and you're having folks, of course, that hadn't really talked before. We've got our fleet managers, we've got our facility managers, we've got our energy and energy procurement teams that maybe never had actually intersected, and all of a sudden that they do. And of course, the utilities, and trying to make sure that they understand what your roadmap looks like. I know that everybody wants to know about the cost. I'm not putting costs, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit in our questions. What I did is I've kind of highlighted the kinds of things that create more costs than necessary. So the quality of the information about the sites, changes to a site, changes to the hardware, changes to the switchgear, supply chain changes, for example, can actually slow down things. So look for those opportunities to get ahead of that, having plans for the unknowns and ways to mitigate risk. And that can have a dramatic impact on your cost. And certainly the schedule is another thing. And what is it that you're going to be doing? Where are you headed? What is the supply chain to get where you want to go. And the supply chain can be all the equipment, can be the software, can be all of the things that have been talked about. But how do you understand them and find out where they fit into kind of the overall and approvals and contracts? You'd be very surprised that designs can be ready, but if they're not approved, or if there's other additional ideas about how that something's going to work, that you end up with really long delay cycles that are can be frustrating for everyone, from any one of those stakeholders who wasn't maybe the long pole in the tent as far as approvals. And can't emphasize enough that you want to look at this as a program approach that is understood, and it is learning. There's lessons to be learned continually across the board. I'm going to leave it right there. That's my contact information. I'll also be at ACT Expo. On my following slide, if we do flip there for one moment, some of the guides that I mentioned, you're very welcome to reach out and grab some of those or links, and some of them you can email. With that, I'm going to turn it back over for Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Paul. This is Jessie Lund here, and at this time, we'll transition to the moderated question and answer portion of the webinar. I want to thank all of our attendees today for submitting some great questions along the way. We've got a lot, probably more than we can go through, so I'll ask the presenters to please keep their responses short and sweet so that we can get through as many as possible in the remaining time. And that said, I'm going to give our first question over to David. So Paul talked a little bit about cost here at the end of his presentation, but unsurprisingly, we've gotten a lot of questions about what sorts of costs folks should plan for, both for the equipment itself as well as for the software. And so I'm curious, David, if there's anything you want to add in terms of how fleets and others should be thinking about cost planning.
Sure. If you'd asked me this question for like light duty vehicles, I'd give you an answer because we have a lot of experience with that. And those more or less tend to be similar. When we're talking about fleets, if we were to categorize sort of a one-off charging station, or like a bank of like 5 level 2 charging stations, yeah, we can probably give you a number for that. So that's like a per installed, excluding the actual price of the charging station, the installation cost, labor, all of that ranges from anywhere from like 5,000 to 10,000, and that's a range because there's some higher cost, easy installations. There are some lower cost, low cost installations. So it really varies. But that's not really, I think, what we're talking about, right? We're talking about how do you start putting in the infrastructure for a depot for medium and heavy duty vehicles. And that is really a difficult question to answer when it comes to a cost, to just giving a rule of thumb cost number. I think the best way to approach that is to actually break down the cost components and start figuring out what each of those components is in terms of how much they cost, and then start applying those to a project. Because as Paul mentioned, if you really need medium voltage, that's very different than taking, low voltage, or rather taking medium voltage off the grid and then stepping that down, or the utility steps that down for you and they give you lower voltage power, then you design a system around that. And there's just too much variability. I can think of 2 package delivery companies, and I think of both of their depots, and I can give you wildly different answers. So unfortunately, I can't give you so much on the infrastructure cost there. Software costs also vary because different companies price their software differently. ChargePoint does software licensing fees on an annual basis, and we do prepaid, but different companies do it differently. So happy to follow up outside of this, but I'll pass it back to Jessie for more questions.
Awesome. Thank you, David. Our next question, I think, Paul, maybe you could best answer this, but some fleets have mentioned concerns about where they locate their chargers on the property, and that where works best for the fleet may not be where works best from the utility perspective. Since you're kind of intermediating between these two stakeholders, anything that you can share in terms of lessons learned or how to kind of balance those competing priorities?
Yeah, it's kind of tricky, so there's an honest linear foot cost to do these things in concrete, conduit, copper, trenching, and all of those sorts of things. And the further you go, you might need to use larger conductors from, say, the utilities vault or their point of contact onto that particular site. So what we are seeing is sometimes the sites are operationally, you got to realize they're a business, they're a fleet that operates. So if they need to bobtail in their semi tractors into a particular part of the lot, and that's not where the utility is, then you've definitely got a challenge there. So you have to find ways to either augment the project cost or find ways to redesign a site. And I think that that's part of the portfolio approach that we might take. If you have lots of yards that you're exploring for how it's going to work, find the easiest ones, but don't forget about the more expensive ones, because they're going to have to be cost averaged into the overall approach. So it's just copper, trenching, and conduit. And I know there's some challenges about how you do those rights of way. So, and perhaps Kim can maybe even talk a little bit about how to make it, if there's a way to make it easier.
Great, thank you, Paul. And Kim, yeah, if you've got anything to add there, I'm sure folks would love to hear it. I also have another question for you. Fleets have expressed concerns that a 10-year asset commitment is required to take advantage of these sorts of programs, not just PG&Es, but a lot of these fleet electrification programs that we're seeing throughout the country, primarily because fleets may lease their property for a period less than 10 years and may not have bargaining power with their leaser. So the question really is, what, if anything, can PG&E and other utilities do to mitigate issues arising from this perceived lack of project life flexibility with fleets who are interested in electrification?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something that we're still working through as we learn about different projects that have these kinds of situations, or say they are leasing vehicles or property. So yeah, we kind of just take it on a case-by-case basis and assess the project and what their build-out plan is and how we can best help them out. In some cases, we may build for a portion, and then if they do have to back out, then kind of prorate for a portion that they may not be able to cover.
Excellent, thank you. And I've got one more for you. That one was a little tricky, but I've got what I think will be a pretty easy one. Some folks are curious when you expect to have the approved list of chargers available, and if it will be available on the website.
Yes, great question. So yeah, we're running the RFQ now for that, and hopefully end of this month or early May, we should have our final list, and then shortly after, it will definitely be on the website for everyone to check out.
Excellent, thank you so much. This next question, I'll open up to anyone who wants to respond. Essentially, it's around what you see as the top challenges to infrastructure rollout, and I've gotten a lot of questions, particularly around kind of the lack of standardization of the connectors, as well as just all of the site-by-site, case-by-case issues. But anyone want to jump in with what you see as the main challenges for rollout?
Yeah, this is Mike. I'll start. A lot of that conversation today has been about, think about the long term, get all the people involved, and on and on. And I would say yes, but we also have to walk. You got to crawl, walk, and run here. So we've talked to a lot of fleets, and they get pretty quickly, they get to the deer in the headlights look around electrification, because you've got the challenge of who you're going to buy the truck from, how big you need to buy the truck from. Then you think about the charging stuff, and you see this being, very early on in the maturity of all this. And then we ask them to think long term, and it's just like, oh my God, I can't do it. So I think we have to also mix in, crawling and walking and running. It's going to be okay in a year to deploy one electric truck or a couple electric trucks or 5, not that that you have to jump to 30, 50 or all of the trucks at the site. We've also thought about that in terms of many times people look at here's where we are now, and here's the end state. So today we fuel up maybe gas and diesel at a particular location, and then we think about the end state being that they're all electrified. Well, Paul and I think Dave also hit on it, and maybe Kim did as well. There's a transition here that's going to take 10, 15 years. You think about let's just use UPS, and they have a site, those little brown trucks, they last 15 to 20 years. The tractors last 10 to 12. And so there will be a long transition here where these fleets have to both fuel maybe gas, diesel, maybe natural gas too, amongst electric, and how they get all those big vehicles in and around the location and in the right place for fueling. That transition also. So yes, have the end in mind, but I think also let's just get started with some of this and not be afraid.
Yeah, and this is David Peterson from ChargePoint. I'll add to that. I think those are right on. And the only comment I want to make is the sort of starting point, the small pilots, the experimental experience with electric vehicles initially, or at the small number of them. Whatever solutions are being used to charge those vehicles today may not actually be the solutions that are going to be the long-term ones that are deployed at scale. And I think that's something really important for people to think about, because we don't want them to necessarily draw the wrong conclusions from the way they fuel and the technology being used to fuel their vehicles today. So that's the only thing I wanted to mention. Fueling a fleet of like 200 vehicles, the best way to do that might look very different than what you do for 3 or 4.
So I want to throw out this, Paul, for Black Beach. The big challenge we're starting to see, and it's kind of, how do you integrate that into your existing operations? The more charging and transformers and things that you need to put on site, we are finding folks having a challenge with constraints. If you're in a very rural setting, maybe not so much, but in a dense urban setting, or a transit agency, or a facility, again, that has space constraints. So to that, what we're also seeing is a lot of exploration around charging automation, and how do you get more vehicles charged in less space, and power share and different things like that, so that you can make some smarter choices about how you're going to use that. And as David said, today's nozzle or charging plug you put in your vehicle may not be tomorrow's, but the switch gear and some of that infrastructure can be logically laid out so you have room for the next items. And those are 20-year odd investments if you go look at the switch gear, or even many longer years, of course, that are in our facilities today. So you can make some of your power and energy roadmaps today and be putting in some least regret investments over time, that the end points might in fact change, or the charger automation, or we didn't get to inductive, and there's conductive. There's all these different ways that are going to emerge. So be aware of that changing landscape.
Thanks, Paul. One additional question on essentially grid capacity. Maybe Kim, you could take this one. Folks are curious, as we see electrification continue to grow in the market, is there sufficient capacity on our modern electric grid, or from the utility perspective, are you anticipating needing to add additional capacity in order to serve these vehicles?
Yeah, good question. So I think, especially as we're entering the medium and heavy duty market, we were talking about in other presentations, much higher capacity is needed to support these vehicles. So a lot of the projects that we're seeing coming through early on definitely need some pretty significant upgrades. So that's for sure a trend that we are seeing, especially with EV fleet program so far.
I might add something to that, and Jessie, is that we're looking at 100% adoption scenarios. So we have a lot of interesting smart people that not just the infrastructure, but the renewable planning, the grid planning type exercises And so we're looking really deep at that. Like if in say, California, you need to have 50% more energy to power transportation, how will you do that? How will you make those investments go the furthest? And the great news is, of course, is these batteries in the vehicles are part of the solution to have those batteries available for larger amounts of generation when and absorbing it, and whether there's storage involved, of course, many different things. But you know, we're pretty confident we can work out those pieces for the grid.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. Well, I see that we're a little past the hour already, so we'll have to wrap up the webinar here. I apologize if we didn't get to a question that you submitted today. I'd like to extend a sincere thanks to all of our presenters, Kim, David, Paul, and Mike, for sharing their expertise with all of us. I encourage all of you on the line to look out for a follow-up email with the recorded link tomorrow. It will also include PDFs of the presentations that were presented here. As a reminder, please fill out the quick 30-second survey that will pop up as you leave the webinar. And finally, just thank you again for joining us today.